about to make now is to frame the remaining part of the workshop. I think you will agree that we've had 3 stimulating speakers, and it's very difficult for me to follow the kind of quality that we've just had. But what I'd like to do is to take you through, and apologies for those who were present yesterday. I'll try and avoid as much repetition as I can, but I'm also aware that many of you were not there present yesterday. I would like to present the framework of the Omega Centre's research on mega projects, decision making and planning, appraisal, delivery. And my colleague Phil Wright will, after lunch, go into a little bit more greater depth about the lessons we found. And because these experiences of the research was undertaken in the so-called developed world, we are extremely interested to know 2 things. Is what of what we found resonates from development contexts which are very different from the developed world so-called, and secondly, to also bear in mind that context is not just geographical, it's also temporal, and that the context may be changing globally. It's not just that when you go to China and India, you find different development contexts. What you have here is that the whole world is actually having a global context which is changing, and so therefore the power of context, which we found as one of our conclusions, very, very significant. It affects what we discovered. In other words, to what extent did we find was a product of the context of the time rather than necessarily the context of the future, it needs to be examined. So enough of that. I explained yesterday to my colleagues who were present the awkward story about the nephew-niece, the 5-year-old, who asks, "Why does Granny have a moustache?" The same question here is, what constitutes a successful mega transport project? We don't actually ask the question. We immediately go into criteria against which we automatically presume projects are to be judged successes or failures. So what I'd like to do is to go through the way we investigated. I mean, many of you know I worked with Ben Flubier as the project manager for his research program, which he subsequently published. And in that regard, he had a hypothesis which he then proved or disproved, depending on where you stand and what you believe, or how much of it you believe or where you stand. Whereas we really didn't have a hypothesis. We were actually searching for patterns of knowledge, especially from storytelling of those who are involved. So there is an element of, I wouldn't say innovation, but some describe it as innovative thinking about what you relate to, what is in the public domain knowledge books of published materials, and what is in the storytelling of those involved. And then what we would like to, but Phil will be elaborating on this much more, is to talk about what we found, and then we are most interested in what we found in terms of what resonates with yourself, with your own plan. There's been concerns internationally about the capability and mega urban transport projects. I mean, urban areas we define differently, but we should talk about mega transport projects as well. There's been a concern about them not being produced on time, within budget, and delivering the benefits that are associated with them. Our point was, over and above that, the 21st century, and this was highlighted by Ulrich Beck's work in the 1990s, the 21st century poses some major uncertainties, risks that, oh my gosh, have they really come to roost? And John certainly did so in his work. But of course, the reaction to the risks and uncertainties, whether in John's point there's been an overreaction to it, or the effect point is an insufficient reaction, it is another field of this investigation. The fact that the transfer of management of financial risk from the public to the private sector would introduce new disciplines and greater reliabilities has actually not been borne out. A lot of mythology about it. It's not been brought out by our research, although there is an element there. But what is most clearly important is for these claims to be monitored, substantiated by evidence, rather than proclaimed to be a fact. Those of you who are not familiar with the Omega Centre and its partners, we had partners with universities in 9 other countries, in Europe, and forgive me if I don't go through them all, but they're in the book, and forgive apologies to my partners without mentioning each partner individually, but the universities we're associated with, the PIs and the team members are in our reports. I explained earlier on that we specifically chose countries in which we felt we would have access to narratives. And I have worked a great deal in the so-called developing world, and I know that our approach may have encountered major problems if we had pursued it there as well, although I may be wrong. We interviewed 300 key decision makers, stakeholders, in 10 countries dealing with 30 projects. And we produced a final report in October 2011. It took us some time to disseminate this out. The report is 6 volumes. And to get an executive summary, those of you who are engaged in complex research, once you've come to research, the next thing is to avoid alienating people with the complexity of your findings, because not many people have got time to listen to you about the multitude of findings you've got. You've then got to sort of summarise them. But to return to the bold question, what actually constitutes a successful MTP, needs to be framed. And we framed it in a speculative framework of what can be anticipated, which in itself is an open question, of what the risks, uncertainties and opportunities that the 21st century offers. Not a template of what happened in the past, which is John's argument that projecting the past into the future only takes us so far and may be very much in the wrong direction. Our starting point was that, albeit important, especially for delivery, the judgment of success and failure on time and budget within prescribed specification, the iron triangle considerations of project management, is important but is insufficient. I would even go so far as to say that I've come to the conclusion it's deliberately focused attention to actually divert attention from other criteria that you should be looking at. Equity being one, environmental issues being another. And so the prolonged, albeit excellent work being done in this field showing optimism, bias and cost generations, the truth is that it keeps us in the frame of project managers looking at projects which actually are not projects. They're program projects, they're meta projects, they're actually planning strategic elements of national plans and beyond. I haven't even mentioned them being instruments for promoting particular hardware and infrastructure projects. What we contend, or what we contended in looking at this area, is that project success needs to look at the project's ability to meet objectives over time, not just the project objectives that were identified at the outset and then revisited, and to judge the project that were objectives developed 30 years ago. This is absolute nonsense, in that many of these projects that were implemented 30 years later were not the same projects which they were costed initially. Secondly, as Peter's work and Brendan Jessup's work has pointed out that values of success and failure change in societies and time. And so what was considered a failure in one societal time period can actually change very differently. Our knowledge now about climate change, environmental dimensions, introduces what was the Friends of the Earth concern back in the 70s, has brought forward into the policy arena today, at least hopefully according to the rhetoric, has brought environmental issues to the forefront. So values change, visions change. And there are then cultural contexts. The templating of mega projects, we began to develop a pattern on this. The same global players are by and large templating mega projects globally. It's extremely lucrative business. There are parties going now, they describe them as the emerging world, where all the growth exists, offers very lucrative returns. We had a presentation at the Younger Seminar recently where the rate of return for the metro in Lagos by the private investors, would you believe, was estimated to be 20% per annum. Now, if they achieve that, that's puzzling. The fact that it can be achieved, then you ask, how is that being funded? Where is that 20% return coming from? Which opens up questions. Now, we posed a number of questions, generic questions. I've already raised one, the king of the successful mega project. Given Ehrlich Beck's work, the next question we have: how well was risk, uncertainty and complexity treated by planning, appraisal and delivery of such projects? And then the third one is: how important is context in making judgments? Temporal context, geographical, cultural, political context. So they were the questions that the 10 country teams investigated within their narratives, within the literature. And one of the most important, again, my apologies to those who were there yesterday, it is actually the definition of a mega transport project. And we had an example of that yesterday, where the Big Dig was described as a transportation project. The definition of the boundaries of a project are not clear and different according to different stakeholders. And so when people judge the failure of success, they're actually not necessarily talking about the same thing. Sometimes these mega transport projects are not transport projects at all. They are actually part of the infrastructure strategy with much more to do it. In other cases, they're just purely transportation projects. The other thing is one party's success is another party's failure. So the stakeholder perceptions will differ. And at some stage, there needs to be a decision to go ahead, not to go ahead, and how to go ahead. And then finally, and this is, we struggle with this, we have to say, which is partly why, and I hope you don't mind us presenting our quandary to you, is how much of what we call generic lessons are actually generic, or are they templating what we found in the so-called West. Okay, we need to look at the objectives of projects, but we also sought to investigate the relationship of project objectives with sustainability. How much rhetoric, how much reality, and how much content was there. I won't go through all these because I think I'll probably run a bit out of time. But what we attempted to do is to come up with a set of lessons that are significant and which we think in a generic way, and relate them in some cases to what stakeholders might do differently had they taken these lessons into account. I think, once again, I'm not going to go into this methodology diagram. You will all have I hope you all stay for the launch of the executive summary, which we will hand out at the reception this afternoon, and so you can read the details. The only significant thing about this diagram is that the premise that you can find knowledge in this field in published books, articles, consultancy reports is only part of the knowledge is actually also within the stories and experiences of those who are involved in it. And we also discovered that in the private sector they cherished that knowledge to a point that they did not reveal it to other parties because it gave them a commercial edge in terms of doing the next project. So public paid-for projects create knowledge which is then privatised by those who did the project and is kept as a competitive edge for the next competitive bid. 18 projects in Europe, 6 in Asia and 3 in Australia. Once again, if I may, I hope I'm not going too fast, but these are the projects that were examined in those countries. One of the things you may be interested that we inevitably came across, and you heard this Ken Livingston saying a moment ago, the relationship between mega projects and mega events. Now, I worked in Hong Kong, as did Phil, at the time of pre-1997. It was very clear that the mega projects had, or were they had to be finished, and there were more to come by the handover. That event made fast-tracking, what I call putting mega projects on steroids. Fast-tracking of projects by a particular date, for better or worse, and there are discussions to be had. Similarly so, we heard today from Ken, and also we see it in Athens, that the planetary alignment of the Olympic Games and projects that were hanging around for decades make the time to strike. So politicians bundle together projects on the basis of opportunism, for better or worse, depending on where you stand. So the relationship, I'm just mentioning one of the findings, is that the relationship between mega events and mega projects is quite significant. The other relationship that we found, which, although I'm a little bit cheating here because I'm going ahead of time, is that mega projects spawn mega projects. And this is where John's thesis comes in, the extent to which we go along with one mega project spawn another, assuming that this is what we really want, this is what we need, and what the implications are. We came up with a number of findings. I have to, James, I think all of us involved in the work, some of the findings we truly didn't know beforehand, and I think other findings we confirmed some of our suspicions. What struck me from the beginning is, why is it a university, I mean, not wishing to demean the support that we've got from VREF, why is it that a university with and it was 25 million kroner, but if you look at the value of about every project was above 1 billion, but why is it it's left to us, a small unit, albeit at UCL, with VREF, to undertake a study of mega projects when governments, nations, companies are pouring billions into projects, I would say by the hour almost. Why is it there's no systematic learning? It is a question which either suggests incompetence or suggests the privatization of knowledge, or suggests an irresponsibility which goes with incompetence by policymakers, governments. If we are going to invest in the next big project, let's know what the previous project did, how it achieved, for whom, for who. So, just very quickly then, the topics that we covered, the topics that we made observations on, the topics that we got lessons from, and I'm going to repeat. There is a health warning. The power of context we recognise is hugely important. You could argue that our findings are a product of the economic context, because these projects were between 1990, if I remember correctly, and 2010. Or yes. So you could argue that our findings are findings of the time. Quite relaxed, or some of them are. You could argue that these are timings of a so-called developed world which is in decline. Or you could argue that there are lessons to re-examine to see how much of this relates to the metro in Delhi, the fast trains in China, the Latin American experiences of BRT and metros and the like. What did we come up with? Well, first of all, the idea of success and failure is dominated by project managers, when in fact one of the main issues was that the risks and uncertainty projects are not only within the project, in fact they're much greater to the project outside of the project. And this was shown by Peter Hall in 1980, it was shown by by Friend and Jessup in 1978. Why is it that we have ignored the risks and opportunities that exist in the policy envelopes around these projects, and we actually confine ourselves to the risks and uncertainties within projects? It has, to this day, and I will say this very bluntly, that the culture and knowledge of project management, like cost-benefit analysis, has been stretched beyond its capability into the field of policy making. They treat policy making and they treat cost-benefit analysis, treat these projects as if they are economic products and as if they are things to be produced on time, on budget, according to specifications, irrespective of the fact that politics has made these projects, forced these projects to adapt to political realities, and also, most importantly, that another conclusion of ours is that actually infrastructure projects are not engineering artifacts, really, they're organic phenomena. They adapt to the environments, and indeed they also adapt the environments through which they traverse. So you need to go to the ecological, to the systems thinking of holistic open systems to understand how you go about planning, and not the project management closed systems of looking at projects as if they are bounded neatly and tightly, although I would have to emphasize that that needs to be done when it comes to delivery. You can't have an open system all the time. You need closed systems to deliver. The engagement of project stakeholders is a continuous headache, but there is evidence to suggest that the earlier you engage a wider public consultation, the less delay, the less friction you encounter later on. The biggest problem here, without going into too much depth, is the issue of trust and transparency. As we rely more and more on private sector investment, so the access to information to monitor the effectiveness of previous investments becomes more and more opaque. We actually had to get some information from the back door on the CTRL, because the CTRL was run by Eurostar, which actually was funded by the French government and by the British government, ostensibly, but they were a private company, so we weren't allowed access to their data because it was of competitive advantage. Nonsense. So, there are a whole host of areas here, each one of them with a depth that you can do more research in, but I think that we've gone beyond that. We feel that we need to get these messages out to policymakers and industry, because we feel that they are threats and risks to the infrastructure investment sustainability of these projects. Most significantly, we find that non-fit-for-purpose techniques of appraisal and planning are being used. And this is known, and yet they continue to be used. The politicians understand this, and they ignore them, and yet there's an industry in appraisal of a particular methodology that doesn't actually inform in any great depth a broad spectrum of stakeholders, except for perhaps the investors. There is no doubt about it that governance and regulatory frameworks have huge questions to be answered for. Special vehicles are created for their fast delivery. Here in the UK, the planning system has been interrupted in order to allow major projects to go ahead, so they're put outside of the planning system. And the scanning of what may happen if the context changes has been most dramatically highlighted by the current situation of moving from boom into austerity. What strategy do you have for a major project when you move from one context to another, and that's in the same place? The sustainability issues and concerns, to what extent is the rhetoric overriding the reality? And most important of all, how significant and how important, which is one reason why I'm making this presentation to you here.
Harry?
Yes.
How many minutes?
I don't know. I've gone over. I've got 5.
I would say 3.
He always does this to me, every time. And he's worse than my wife. You know, my wife does 3 minutes. So, there may be, what you're really trying to say is there may be something in that. But anyway, I'm coming to my last one, I think. Thank you, Mark. Thank you very much. The conclusions we came and which Phil will go into. I've got 5 minutes,
After 2 minutes, you still have 5 minutes more.
So anyway, at this rate, I'll use all the 5 minutes denying the conclusions that we arrived at, which will be elaborated later on. It is that mega projects need to be looked at as agents of change. And the examination of change, of course, needs to be assessed by multiple criteria. And these criteria need to vary depending on development contexts, whether they are geographical, whether they're temporal, or whether they have other relationships. Secondly, as I've already alluded to, we came to the conclusion that to look at mega projects as closed systems is disastrous, not only for the project's risk resilience, but also for the areas that they traverse. But there needs to be a better understanding of the impact of them on related transportation systems, cities and regions, and vice versa. The other point that we concluded was that essentially a lot of the problem is how these projects are framed and who they are framed by. I think that both Peter and Ken alluded to this. The other point I've already alluded to is the fact that the context sensitivity issue has not really been examined, and the sustainability treatment. We have moved. I appreciate John's point about differences in definition and operationalisation of the concept of sustainability, but there has been movement here, and I think in that regard there needs to be some sensitivity to that movement of ideas. The engagement of stakeholders beyond key investors is crucial. The institutional policy and regulatory frameworks, once again, are imperatively important. And if you don't have the capacity in the public sector, as Ken alluded to earlier, to aggressively respond to what can very often be aggressive private sector activity, then you're already onto a losing wicket. And then finally, the issue of lesson learning, lesson sharing. So I've now got 2 minutes, and I will finish within that period of time. I think the question that we need to ask ourselves essentially is, why are we continuing to use the same framing, same methodologies, when actually now the context shows that these methodologies, if ever before, are not fit for purpose? And the other question, of course, I know the reason why we are, and that is we don't have anything in place to immediately to tackle all these rapidly changing contextual situations. But I think that we, like climate change, like energy peaking, I think we're into complex problems, global problems with local impacts that we actually need to think and frame these projects differently in order to respond more effectively. I think I'll leave it at that, except for one very last point. One issue, very, very apparent, and the military will tell you this. Where you have complexity and you need to understand the complexity that you are responding to, because the detail of this is so tremendously challenging, you cannot possibly go into every detail aspect. And so consequently, strategy is critical. You have to have a strategy to deal with these complex issues, and this is not project management. Strategy takes you into the arena of policy making, takes you into the arena of planning, but also takes you to the arena of delivery. Thank you.